The noise from the coffee shop drowned out any attempt at silence, but there was no ignoring the shrill sound of laughter that echoed as coffee dripped down the waitress's already stained apron. She had tripped, and the hot beverage spilled onto the counter in front of a group of customers who, instead of helping, raised their cell phones ready to record the embarrassment. "This is why people like you will never leave here," said one of the women, wearing high heels, laughing loudly, while others applauded the humiliation as if it were a spectacle. The young woman's teary eyes met a sea of indifferent gazes, some even pleased with the embarrassment. In that moment, every second felt like an eternity, as if the entire weight of her life was summed up in that public scene of contempt. Not a single customer raised a hand to defend her. Only laughter, judgment, and indifference filled the space, transforming her pain into entertainment. But between the tables, there was a different. "Look!" A man discreet without ostentatious luxury watched in silence. It wasn't just compassion in his eyes, but an intensity that seemed to see beyond the cheap uniform and the blush of shame. While the laughter still echoed, he slowly stood up, the movement cutting through the atmosphere like an invisible blade. He approached the young woman, ignoring the jokes, and said in a firm voice, "Enough." Silence fell like a weight over the coffee shop, and cell phones went down. But the real turning point would come seconds later, when one of the arrogant men muttered, "Who do you think you are to tell me to shut up?" The answer came not in words, but in the reaction of the others as they recognized his face. Whispers began to spread. This man was the discreet millionaire, owner of half the Starbucks franchises on the East Coast. The atmosphere, previously filled with contempt, now plunged into a dense discomfort, and everyone knew the story would not end there. What will happen? After this twist, get ready, because what comes next will surprise you. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in her place? The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the rhythmic sound of cups being placed on the counter, creating an almost musical backdrop to the hurried New York morning. The exposed brick walls and yellowish lighting attempted to give the coffee shop a welcoming atmosphere, but at that moment, the ambience felt cold and impersonal, as if every glance were filled with disguised judgment. The young waitress moved quickly, her simple uniform already slightly worn by time, her apron stained from so many daily battles known only to her. Her trembling hands held the tray, but her smile persisted, even though her eyes betrayed fatigue and loneliness. Between the tables, hurried executives typed on their laptops, tourists snapped photos of cups bearing the green logo, and regulars ordered their complicated drinks as if the world depended on a latte or a frappuccino served at just the right temperature. She had already learned to become invisible, to walk among people who didn't see her as someone, but merely as part of the scenery. When a glass fell, everyone looked not to help, but to criticize. When she smiled, almost no one smiled back. In that space, her presence was felt more in her mistakes than in her successes. Still, there was a quiet dignity in every movement, a constant effort to prove to herself that resistance was worth it. With each request taken, with each thank you that went unanswered, a piece of her grew stronger, without anyone noticing. The light rain falling outside was reflected in the cafe's enormous windows, and the city seemed indifferent to the young woman's invisible plight. As she cleaned a table, she heard exaggerated laughter from a group occupying the center of the room. They were young adults, dressed in expensive clothes and perfumed with arrogance. With each order, they demanded haste as if she were merely an extension of their will. One of them even shook his nearly empty glass, as if ringing a bell to summon a servant, and the look of contempt on his face made it clear he saw not a person before him, but merely a disposable employee. Across the way, in a discreet corner, a man silently observed everything. Unlike the other customers, he wasn't there to show off his status or rush. His presence was almost invisible, but there was a weight in his eyes, as if carrying too many stories to fit into words. He was fiddling with his cell phone, but his attention wasn't completely diverted from the waitress. His gaze wasn't judgmental, but rather analytical, as if he were absorbing every detail of the scene. While the laughter echoed and the arrogant customers transformed the cafe into a stage for ostentation, he remained motionless, attentive, waiting for the moment when something inevitable would happen. The tension between the two worlds, that of the waitress struggling to stay upright and that of the customers laughing from their leather chairs, was invisible, but real. One false move was all it took for everything to fall apart, and that morning, fate was already preparing the first crack. From a young age, her life had been marked by absences. She grew up in a forgotten neighborhood where the houses were made of cheap wood and the cold winter wind cut through the walls like invisible blades. Her father had disappeared before she was even old enough to ask why, and her mother, suffocated by the weight of 2 long shifts and an unforgiving loneliness, eventually gave in to exhaustion and drink. The girl learned early on to fend for herself, to cook with little, to mend clothes to last another winter, and to shoulder responsibilities that should never have fallen to someone so young. Poverty wasn't just a lack of money. It was the constant feeling of being on the margins of the world. At school, she felt the cross glances of her classmates when they noticed her lunch was wrapped in newspaper, or that her sneakers were always the same, worn, the soles almost coming off. Silence was her defense. She learned not to ask, not to expect, not to dream of great things. What she had was always enough, even when it wasn't. Her heart held a secret space, an inner refuge where she silently nurtured a fragile hope that one day she could change her story. As a teenager, she encountered the cruelest face of human indifference. While some girls had birthday parties in brightly lit rooms, hers consisted of a makeshift cake with mismatched candles, lit by her mother between sips from a bottle. Still, she smiled, knowing it was all her mother could offer. Over time, she saw the house empty. First, her mother left for good, overcome by addictions and loneliness. Then came her neighbors, who moved to better neighborhoods, leaving behind only the echo of laughter and closing doors. She was left alone, supported by informal jobs, washing dishes in diners, cleaning houses, delivering newspapers. But it was in the cafe that she found refuge. The Starbucks where she now worked had initially been just an opportunity to pay her overdue bills. Over time, it became a kind of second home, even if marked by the coldness of the customers. There she felt part of something, albeit invisible. The cafe was a showcase for the world, and she, a secondary character in a show, that didn't recognize her. She carried within herself the scars of her childhood, but also a silent pride, that of never having given up. When she arrived home in a small suburban apartment, the silence still weighed heavily. The walls were peeling, the sofa was torn, the refrigerator was nearly empty. But on the table there was always an old notebook, where she wrote down thoughts, dreams, and bits of stories she made up for herself. It was her way of resisting, transforming her pain into words no one read, but which reminded her that she was still capable of feeling. And it was this invisible strength, born of abandonment and pain, that sustained her through each daily humiliation. The past had hardened her on the outside, but inside, a flame still burned, waiting for its chance to shine. A flame that, unbeknownst to her, was about to illuminate lives beyond her own. It was a seemingly ordinary morning, but fate had already set the scene that would change everything. The group of arrogant young people, who usually frequented the coffee shop like catwalk models, decided that today would be the day to turn her work into a spectacle. They wore designer clothes, spoke loudly as if the whole world were an audience, and laughed among themselves, fueling a cruel energy that found pleasure in belittling others. The waitress, with her tray firmly in hand and a weary look in her eyes, approached to take their orders, already accustomed to their demanding tone. But this time there was something different, a premeditated, almost rehearsed provocation. One of the young men, his hair slicked back and his watch glinting in the light, glanced at his friends before speaking. "I bet you $100 she'll get my order wrong," he said, laughing out loud. The others laughed along like hyenas circling their prey. The waitress felt the weight of the words like an invisible punch. It wasn't just a request, it was a trap. Their game wasn't about coffee, but about humiliating, turning her dedication into a laughingstock. Cappuccino, no foam with almond milk. 2 extra shots of espresso. But I want half hot and half iced, the young man added purposefully. A nearly impossible request, designed solely to confuse her. The friends leaned over the table, anxious for the mistake. One of them even pulled his cell phone from his pocket, ready to record the moment. The waitress took a deep breath, calmly wrote it down, and walked toward the counter, her heart racing. It wasn't the first time she'd been the target of ridicule, but there was something incredibly cruel about the bet, as if her dignity had been reduced to a cheap game. As she prepared the drink, the laughter in the background echoed like hammer blows. When she returned to the table, she carefully placed the cup in front of him. "Here you go, sir." The young man looked at it, smirked, and, without even tasting it, said, "Wrong. I bet you couldn't. Look, I won." The table erupted in laughter, and the sound seemed to carry throughout the cafe. The waitress tried to keep a straight face, but felt her eyes well up. There was no way she could win. If she had done it right, they would have invented another reason. If she had done it wrong, as they said, it would just be another reason for humiliation. The scene gained momentum when one of the women in the group, her nails painted bright red, picked up the cup and dumped the contents into the trash can next to her, as if it were trash. "This girl isn't even good enough to serve coffee," she said loudly for everyone to hear. The collective laughter grew even louder, and the looks of other customers were divided between indifference and silent complicity. No one defended her, no one said anything. At that moment, the waitress wasn't just carrying an empty tray, but the weight of a public humiliation that seemed to crush her before everyone. The group, pleased with their own cruelty, clinked glasses from other orders, celebrating as if they had won an imaginary war. And as she walked back to the counter, her chest burning, she didn't notice a pair of eyes in the most discreet corner of the cafe, following every detail of the scene. The millionaire hadn't yet moved, but his silent presence was already beginning to cast a shadow over that theater of contempt. She took a deep breath behind the counter, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions that threatened to burst into tears. Her heart pounded, not because of the error in her order, which deep down she knew hadn't been a mistake, but because of the group's rehearsed cruelty, which had turned her work routine into a public spectacle. She tried to focus on filling a new cup, ignoring the stares, but the laughter still echoed, as if mocking even her silence. It was at that moment that she felt a presence nearby. It was no longer an impatient customer, nor someone with another complicated order. It was him, the man who had observed everything silently from the far corner of the cafe. His voice wasn't filled with shouts or exaggerated gestures. It was low but firm, the kind of tone that silences any commotion. "Are you okay?" he asked, and those 3 words, so simple, sounded almost impossible to her. Someone had noticed her pain. Someone had stopped the world itself to acknowledge her. She looked up, surprised, and met a gaze that held no judgment, only respect, and a calm seriousness that seemed to see far beyond the worn apron. For a second she couldn't respond. She just blinked, trying to hide her emotion, and nodded. He, however, remained unconvinced. "That's not right," he continued, his voice firm. It was then that the group of young people noticed their approach. The young man with the expensive watch, still laughing, turned to the man. "And who are you to give an opinion? Are you uncomfortable? Just drink your coffee and stay in your corner." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. The man didn't respond immediately, just stood straight, staring at the group with a calmness that was more frightening than any shout. He then turned his gaze to her, completely ignoring the arrogant men. "Don't feel inferior because of them. A person's worth isn't measured by how others treat them." The words were simple, but the way they were said, with firmness and conviction, pierced the heavy air of the cafeteria. For the first time in a long time, she felt someone saw her, not as an employee, not as a target, but as a person. The group, uncomfortable with the attention no longer on them, tried to react. The woman with the red nails laughed out loud. "Look at that! A white knight defending the poor waitress. I bet he's just another lost soul trying to look like a hero." but her laughter sounded forced. Something about his presence was unsettling them. The man, without changing his tone, replied, "The truly lost soul is the one who needs to put others down to feel important." An awkward silence filled the room. Customers who had previously pretended not to hear now discreetly raised their eyes, attentive to the silent confrontation. The waitress, still unable to understand who the man was, felt a mixture of relief and confusion. He didn't need to get involved. He could simply finish his coffee and leave like everyone else. But he had decided to intervene, and his voice, calm and deep, had cut through the laughter like a blade. She backed away a little, unsure how to react, but each step was accompanied by that steady gaze. It wasn't a look of pity, but of someone who seemed to recognize a hidden truth within her. It was their first contact, seemingly trivial, but carrying the weight of something greater. The millionaire hadn't revealed anything about himself, but in that brief exchange, he had planted a seed that would change their fates forever. The silence that had hung in the air after the intervention seemed too fragile to last. The group, uncomfortable with having their fun interrupted, decided to redouble their cruelty. The young man with the expensive watch stood up slowly, as if to prove he was still in control of the scene. His friends chuckled softly, encouraging him. He approached the counter, looking at the waitress with contempt. "You know, people like you should be grateful that we spend our money here. Without customers like us, you'd be out on the street." His voice was loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear, and immediately some eyes turned their way. The waitress remained silent, clutching the cleaning cloth with trembling hands. The words were like knives, but her dignity wouldn't let her react. The woman with the red nails, savoring the spectacle, decided to step in. With a venomous smile, she took a $20 bill from her purse and tossed it on the floor at the young woman's feet. "Take it. It's more than you should earn in an hour. This should remind you of your place." The sound of the bill hitting the floor echoed like a slap, and the laughter that followed was even crueler. She froze, her eyes fixed on the note on the floor, her face burning with shame. There was nowhere to run. If she bent down to pick it up, she'd confirm the humiliation. If she didn't, they'd continue laughing, saying she was even rejecting what was too good for her. The weight of that choice was suffocating. Her eyes welled up, but she held her ground, unmoving. And this, rather than intimidating, only fueled the cruelty. The young man, wanting to end the show with a flourish, picked up the glass, still full of his drink, and deliberately tipped it over the counter, letting the liquid drip onto the floor. "Clean this up. That's what you're paid for." The laughter erupted again, echoing through the cafe like a rehearsed chorus of mockery. Some customers looked away, others murmured annoyance, but no one said anything. The audience's complicit silence made the waitress's pain even more acute. She took a deep breath, fighting back tears, and began to mop the floor. Every movement of her hand felt like a blow to her dignity, every laugh behind her a cruel reminder of her position in their eyes. The millionaire, still in his corner, watched with his jaw clenched. His earlier serene gaze now grew more intense, like a storm about to brew. But he still hadn't moved. The humiliation had reached its peak. The waitress was on her knees, mopping the wet floor, while the group clinked glasses in celebration of their petty victory. It was as if the entire cafe had stopped to watch the spectacle of contempt. And deep down she knew it wasn't just a spilled cup. It was because her existence, to them, was nothing more than an inconsequential detail, something to be used, discarded, and ridiculed without consequence. But unbeknownst to them, the scene wouldn't end there. The same audience now laughing would still remember that morning, but in a way they never imagined. The millionaire, patient and silent, just waited for the right moment to stand up, because in that story, poetic justice wouldn't come with shouts. It would come with silence and impact. She was still on her knees, cleaning the soaked floor, but something inside her began to change. It wasn't just the humiliation burning like fire in her chest, but an ancient strength that came from all the years of struggle and resistance. The group still laughed, believing they had won, that they had reduced the young waitress to nothing before the gazes of strangers. But when she finished cleaning and stood, Her eyes were no longer the same. There were no tears, no submission. There was an unsettling calm, a serenity no one expected. She lifted her head, took a deep breath, and in a firm voice said, "You think you know who I am. You think you can define me by this uniform or this floor I cleaned, but the truth is, you know nothing." The words echoed through the cafeteria, shattering the laughter that still hung in the air. The silence settled, heavy, uncomfortable. She wasn't shouting, but the firmness of her voice was like an invisible punch to each of them. The woman with the red nails arched her eyebrow, trying to hide her discomfort. "And who do you think you are? A philosopher now?" But the waitress wasn't intimidated. She continued, looking each of them in the eye. "I've washed dishes in worse places than this. I've slept on mattresses on the floor with the cold biting my skin. I've gone days without eating, so my mother could have a plate on the table. I know the pain of being invisible and the strength of getting back up on my own. You laugh because you've never had to fight. I'm here because I didn't give up. And believe me, I know things about each of you that you'd never once said out loud." A murmur ran through the room. The customers who had previously pretended not to see were now completely attentive. The young man with the expensive watch tried to laugh, but the insecurity in his eyes betrayed him. "You don't know anything about us." And it was at that moment that she let slip the first spark of truth. "Yes, I do. I know you didn't inherit that watch, as you like to say, but you bought it on installments while you owed rent. I know you," she pointed at the woman with the red nails, "were expelled from 2 colleges and hide it from everyone, preferring to humiliate rather than be humiliated. I know you." And so it went, revealing details no one imagined she could know. Shock spread between them like wildfire. How could that waitress know? The answer lay in what had always made her invisible. No one pays attention to who serves, but she always listened, always observed, always kept track. Customers talked too much when they thought no one was listening. And she was. Every phone conversation, every loud argument between friends, every detail escaped amid the noise of the coffee shop. It had all been etched in her memory. When she finished, she took a deep breath and said softly but firmly, "What hurts you isn't what I said. It's knowing it's all true." The silence was now absolute. The group was no longer laughing, just tense looks and closed mouths. For once, the waitress wasn't the target. She was the force no one saw coming. And as he walked back to the counter, head held high, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The weight of the revelation had already turned the tide. He watched her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. This young woman, who minutes before had been the target of cruel humiliation, now stood before everyone like someone carrying an invisible force, impossible to ignore. The millionaire remained silent, but something inside him began to stir. It wasn't just respect for what she had said. It was a strange sense of recognition, as if standing before someone who had once been part of his own story. While the arrogant men, once full of bravado, now avoided looking at her, he stood and walked slowly to the counter. Her eyes, still steady, met his. And for a moment there was a thick silence, a silent link between 2 lives that seemed too distant to intersect. Then he said, in a low tone, "You're not what they think. But you're not just a waitress, are you?" The question hung in the air, like a veiled revelation. She looked away, hesitant, as if carrying something that shouldn't be said. And it was there, in the brief tremor in his hands, that he realized there was a secret, a hidden detail in her past that connected those 2 very different realities. As he drew closer, he noticed a simple necklace around her neck, almost hidden beneath her uniform. It was a thin chain with an antique pendant, worn with age. His eyes fixed on the object, and his heart raced. He recognized that pendant. It had belonged to a woman he had met years ago, a woman who worked as a cleaner in the building where his company had taken its first steps. He remembered her, a woman with a tired smile, but who always had her young daughter with her, waiting in the hallway chairs while her mother cleaned the offices. He remembered the curious look in that girl's eyes, watching him discreetly as she sketched in an old notebook. Now, looking at the waitress in front of him, everything made sense. That girl was her. A shiver ran through him. He not only recognized her, but remembered the silent promise he'd made to himself years ago, to one day repay the kindness of that mother who, even in poverty, always offered him words of encouragement. During the company's most difficult days, he never had the chance. The mother disappeared, and with her the child. Until now. The millionaire took a deep breath, trying to hide his emotion. The waitress, noticing his gaze fixed on her necklace, instinctively reached for the pendant as if protecting it. "It's all I have left of her," she said softly, almost in a whisper. "My mother. She believed that one day I would have a different life. But the world never gave me that chance." The words struck him like an arrow. He knew this was the same woman who years ago had silently given him courage. And now before him stood her daughter, not as a shadow of poverty, but as someone who, despite all the pain, carried the same strength. It was at that moment that he realized that waitress wasn't just another invisible employee. She was the missing link in an old promise, the living reminder of a debt that fate had brought back. The secret was out, but the weight of the revelation was only beginning to shape the new direction of that story. The next morning, the coffee shop was eerily quiet without her. The sound of stacking glasses, the clinking of cups, and even the rhythm of the coffee machine seemed slower, as if the space had lost some of its energy. The millionaire entered discreetly, as he had done in recent days, but didn't find her behind the counter. He asked another attendant about her, who merely replied with a shrug. "She hasn't been back since yesterday. No one knows if she will." Her absence spread through the room like a shadow. Regulars, accustomed to seeing her move in silence, noticed the difference without comment. The millionaire, however, felt something he hadn't expected, an uncomfortable emptiness, as if he'd lost a connection he hadn't even known he needed. He tried to convince himself it was just curiosity, perhaps even concern over the brutal way she'd been treated. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was the feeling of being connected to her by something that transcended that coffee shop. In the days that followed, he searched discreetly. He sent trusted people to investigate, but found almost nothing. She lived in a small apartment in the suburbs, and neighbors barely knew her. They said she left early and returned late, always alone, always carrying modest bags. After the humiliating episode, no one saw her again. The apartment remained closed, as if she had disappeared from the entire city. This disappearance began to affect him unexpectedly. In the silence of his luxurious penthouse, between million-dollar meetings and contracts worth fortunes, her memory lingered like a persistent ghost. He saw her in her uniform, cleaning the floor, but he also saw her as the girl who once stood in the hallways, drawing silently while her mother worked. It was as if the past had returned to demand not just a reckoning, but an awakening. Meanwhile, the young men who had been the protagonists of the cruelty faced unexpected consequences. Videos of the scene had leaked. Someone in the cafeteria had silently filmed the entire thing. The images circulated online, and within days their laughter became a source of collective hatred. Comments called them cruel, arrogant, and inhumane. The humiliation they had inflicted on the waitress was now being turned against them on a larger scale. Firings, cancelled invitations, closed doors. Karma was beginning to take its toll, even if she wasn't there to see it. The millionaire followed everything, but his mind was elsewhere. He wanted to find her, hear her side of the story, understand how life had brought their stories together again. But each attempt seemed to fail. The more he searched, the more distant she became. The emptiness grew, and with it the awareness that her absence wasn't just physical. It was a lack that revealed something in him he'd never admitted, a loneliness that not even his fortune could fill. It was in this silence between her absence and the weight of memories that the transformation that would change his life began to blossom within him. Her disappearance wasn't just a fact, it was a calling. His empire had always seemed untouchable. Magazines featured his face on lavish covers, the corporate world cited him as an example of success, and investors blindly trusted his vision. But when the coffee shop story went viral, the internet wasn't content to punish only the arrogant young men. The public began to ask, who was the man who had stood up to the waitress, Who was this millionaire who until then had lived discreetly behind the scenes? The anonymity he had cultivated for years crumbled in a matter of days, and the social judgment that once seemed destined only for the ruthless group now reached him as well. Articles began to emerge, some praising his actions, but others questioning his intentions. Blogs and newspapers suggested his defense might be a marketing ploy. Wasn't he just looking for free publicity? Read sensationalist headlines. Others accused him of hypocrisy, recalling contracts his company had granted to shutter smaller coffee shops in poor neighborhoods, leaving workers jobless. What had once been silence now became a constant din. The man who had always been seen as distant from the spotlight had become the target of debate, criticism, and even malicious rumors. The pressure mounted. At board meetings, shareholders demanded explanations. On the streets, reporters followed. Him, searching for any word that might make headlines. And on social media, hashtags with his name were accompanied by snap judgments, harsh statements, and demands for a position. For the first time in a long time, he found himself cornered. Not by the threat of losing money, but by the public eye that exposed every detail of his life. The most painful thing was that, amidst all the noise, all he could think about was her, the missing waitress, the one who had revealed her strength in the face. Tale of humiliation, and then vanished without a trace. He knew his public image was at stake, but he sensed that the real downfall wasn't the business. It was the realization that, even surrounded by wealth, he was alone. No fortune could buy the silence that weighed down his empty penthouse at night, or the memory of the steady look she had given him before disappearing. Meanwhile, external pressure mounted. Protests erupted in front of his businesses, people demanding he speak out publicly about social inequality and his stance on humiliation. Suddenly he wasn't just a successful millionaire. He was the symbol of a system many hated and who found in him the perfect face to attack. His glass castle was beginning to crack, not from bankruptcy, but from something much deeper, a loss of trust and the weight of collective judgment. In that scenario, the millionaire realized that true power lay neither in his accumulated wealth nor in the companies he controlled. True power lay in the gaze of that young woman who had single-handedly faced an entire group of cruel men and emerged with her head held high. And, ironically, it was precisely her absence that now made him face his own fragility. The public downfall didn't bring him down financially, but it did lay him bare before himself. For the first time, the man who never bowed felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The following weeks were a harsh mirror held before him. Everything he had ever believed. That money gave him security. That silence protected him. That discretion was his greatest weapon, now proved insufficient. He could close million-dollar deals with a single connection, but he couldn't silence the emptiness growing within him. And for the first time, the millionaire allowed himself to stop. Stop chasing goals, stop hiding behind meetings, stop pretending that success completed him. He began revisiting old memories. He returned to the building where his company had started, ascending to the floor, where he had once worked night after night without sleep. He walked the hallways, and it was there before the now different doors that he remembered the woman who cleaned the offices with silent dedication. The same woman who had told him simple things. Keep going, you can do it. When everyone else doubted. That woman was the waitress's mother, and now, more than ever, he understood the weight of that connection. It was no coincidence that fate had brought her daughter back into his life. With a heavy heart, he began to question himself. What had he done with all the wealth he had built? How many times had he passed by people like her, invisible, and not reached out? The arrogance he saw in the young people at the coffee shop was, in some ways, a reflection of the world he himself had helped create. This realization was like a blow to the neck. He discovered that his greatest flaw was not the way he ran his business, but the way he had allowed his humanity to hide behind power. The transformation began with small gestures. He reappeared discreetly in neighborhood coffee shops, chatting with employees, listening to stories. He created quiet projects to support low-income employees in his franchises. But, unlike what he had always done, he didn't delegate anything. He was present, listening, looking into people's eyes, trying to understand. He felt like a stranger in a world that had always been there, but never allowed himself to see. His nights were no longer filled with spreadsheets and became long hours of reflection. He read the comments on social media, no longer as attacks but as the voices of a people demanding dignity. And in every harsh word, he saw a call. It wasn't about cleaning up his image, it was about truly transforming himself. The comfortable silence he'd always cultivated was no longer enough. For the first time, he wanted to speak, but not in interviews or magazine covers. He wanted to speak to her. He needed to tell her that he finally understood, that he acknowledged her pain, that he knew he owed her more than money. He owed her humanity. The millionaire began to change from within. The pride that once sustained his ego was replaced by a humility that hurt, because it required shattering his own certainties. He discovered that true wealth was not what he accumulated in his coffers, but what he could build in the hearts of those around him. And the more he transformed, the more he realized that her absence was the driving force behind this inner revolution. It was as if his entire life had been a rehearsal for this moment, and all that was missing was finding her again. And in that silent desire, the certainty grew. If he met her again, he would not let her leave without telling her who she really was and what she had awakened in him. It was on a grey afternoon, when the city seemed swept away by the cold New York wind, that their reunion took place. He wasn't sure why he decided to pass through the suburb where he discovered she lived again, perhaps waiting for a sign, perhaps just clinging to his last hope of finding her. He walked slowly, without bodyguards, without luxury cars, just an ordinary man trying to bear in his eyes the weight of everything that had changed within him. And then, as he turned the corner of a narrow street, he saw a familiar figure. She stood there, wearing a simple coat, carrying 2 grocery bags, her hair tied up haphazardly, but with the same upright posture of someone who's learned to survive without support. When their eyes met for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The memory of the coffee shop, the humiliation, the words spoken in a firm voice, came back like a rush. She stopped in surprise, nearly dropping the bags. The millionaire took a deep breath, trying to contain his emotion. He approached slowly, as if he didn't want to frighten anyone. "You disappeared," he said softly, the sound of those 2 words carrying weeks of absence, searching and silence. She stared at him seriously, never looking away. "I had to disappear. Sometimes the only way to survive is to become invisible again." He felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say so many things at once, that he remembered her as a child, that he'd met her mother, that his entire life had changed since she'd left. But nothing came out immediately. He just stood there before her, trying to convey in his eyes what words couldn't yet convey. She took a step back, defensive. "Why are you here? Why do you keep looking for me?" The question was direct like an arrow. He hesitated but answered, "Because I can't forget, not just what happened in that coffee shop, but who you are. You made me see things I never wanted to see." The silence between them was thick. The wind ruffled her loose hair and the bag slipped a little in her hands. He instinctively reached out to grab one of them, and for a moment their hands touched. The shock was immediate, not from the physical contact, but from the weight of their shared memory. She looked at him, her eyes brimming, and said, "You have no idea what I carry. I'm not someone for you to save." He replied in a firm but choked voice, "I don't want to save you. I want to walk beside you. Maybe it's too late, maybe you don't want to, but I needed to find you to tell you this." Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't just from pain. There was a mixture of anger, relief, and something bordering on hope. The reunion wasn't gentle. It wasn't an immediate embrace. It was dense, tense, like 2 scarred lives colliding again. And in that moment, in the middle of the cold, anonymous street, with no audience, no public humiliation, just 2 wounded hearts stared at each other. The millionaire knew the next step wouldn't be his, it would be hers. She remained silent for long seconds, as if each heartbeat were an internal judgment. The cold street wind seemed to whisper around her, carrying not only the weight of their reunion, but all the pain accumulated over years of solitude. He stood before her, not as the millionaire everyone feared or envied, but as a man stripped of all armor. Still, her eyes held open wounds, memories that could not be erased with belated gestures. "You talk like you can just show up and fix everything," she finally said, her voice cracking but firm. "But where were you when I needed you? Where were you when my mother died alone, believing no one was looking out for us? Where were you when I swept diners' floors at 3 in the morning just to have something to eat the next day?" Each word was a blade, not of hate, but of truth. He lowered his eyes, guilt weighing on his chest like never before. There were no excuses. She took a deep breath, clutching the bags like anchors. "I recognize the change in you. I saw in your eyes that something had broken. But I don't know if it's enough. The world hasn't given me many choices, and maybe this is the only chance I have to decide for myself." The silence that followed seemed endless. He leaned a little closer, his voice low and sincere. "I can't erase your past, nor give back what life has taken. But I can be here, truly, without masks, without distance. I don't want you to forgive me out of pity. I want you to decide with your heart, even if that decision is to let me go." The tears finally welled up in her eyes. They weren't just tears of pain, but tears of release. She lifted her face to look at him, and for the first time, there was something soft in her expression. "I don't know if I can forgive everything, but I also know I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying this burden. Maybe forgiveness isn't for you. Maybe it's for me." He looked up, surprised, and saw in that instant that there was no victory, no defeat. There was only truth. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture brief, almost shy, but loaded with meaning. "I make no promises about the future, but today, I won't say goodbye." Her decision wasn't an effusive embrace nor a romantic reunion like in the movies. It was human, real, marked by pain and courage. She chose not to turn her back, but also not to give up everything at once. He chose a path between hurt and hope, between forgiveness and prudence. And in that moment, they both understood that, however cruel the past had been, the future could still be written differently. That night, the city seemed to breathe differently. The lights of New York reflected off the windows wet with drizzle, transforming the streets into a broken mirror of colors and silences. She walked home alone, the light bags in her hands almost forgotten, and each step was accompanied by a strange sense of relief and uncertainty. In her pocket, her fingers touched the antique pendant, the same one she had always carried as a legacy from her mother. For the first time in years, the necklace felt weightless. Across the street, he watched from afar, without approaching. There were no speeches, no promises, just the stillness of someone who understands that certain presences don't need to be announced. They simply exist. The wind blew her coat, and for a brief moment, she glanced back. Her eyes met his, and there were no more questions, only the silent certainty that something had changed forever. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, before continuing on her way. He remained still, motionless, but within him an old weight was melting away. It wasn't a happy ending, nor a sad one. It was simply the beginning of a new way of being, marked by scars that were no longer burdens, but signs of resilience. In the sky, the fine drizzle transformed the lights into scattered glows, as if the city itself bowed to the silence of that moment. And in their hearts, poetic justice came not in shouts or revenge, but in the simple act of continuing to walk. She forward, he vigilant, united not by perfection, but by truth. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in the waitress's shoes? Leave a comment. I'd love to read each one. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to see more stories like this. And now, don't leave yet. There's another video playing that you need to watch. I'm sure it will keep you hooked from start to finish.